Sarah is the founder and principal of Secular Strategies, a company that is empowering policymakers, lawmakers, and change makers to be effective champions of secularism in the United States and pioneering strategies for mobilizing religiously unaffiliated voters. Sarah worked for the Secular Coalition for America from 2013 to 2019 in various roles, including Director of Grassroots and Community Programs and Director of Governmental Affairs. In 2016, she facilitated the establishment of the first ever Secular Caucus in the Texas Democratic Party and worked with secular Democrats to get 3 secular policy resolutions incorporated into the party's platform. She now serves as the Program Director of Secular Democrats of America, PAC, and in her personal capacity, represents the secular community as a co-chair on the Democratic National Committee's Interfaith Council. She helped to pass a resolution in 2019 at the DNC that expressly welcomes religiously unaffiliated voters into the party, recognizing their values and historic marginalization. So Sarah, I will hand it over to you, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I actually want to share just for a little bit of inspiration before I go into some of the threats to church-state separation that I want to bring your attention to, which will hopefully also inspire you to take action. But I want to start with something positive because just on Friday, I had the great privilege of being part of a meeting between the Secular Coalition for America and a number of its member organizations, one of which is my client, with the director and deputy director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And that was a meeting where they heard us and heard our priorities, and we talked about how we can work together. And that was a really historic meeting. There have been some engagements between the White House and secular organizations in the past, but never to the level of the director of this office meeting with these groups in this way. So we're making a lot of great progress. There's a lot of wonderful things happening that we should really take advantage of. So that's to inspire you to do more. That doesn't mean you should be complacent in any way. It means that we have opportunities that we can build on. So there's a lot to be proud of that's happening at the national level. So just wanted to share that because it was recent on Friday and thought folks would like to hear that you are being represented to the White House, which is fantastic. So I'm going to start, yes. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my clients, because I think if any of them are of interest or that you want to hear about them later, you can ask me about them in the Q&A. And I think it gives you it's a great stepping stone into all the different ways that you can be active in the secular space, because they're so sort of broad. So I'll do that really quickly. Then I'm going to talk about just sort of laying the foundation of the threats to church-state separation, the challenges and opportunities around mobilizing non-religious voters, and my recommendations for the main topic, which is secular activism. What are some ways that you can think about both as an individual and as part of a group like Bolder Atheists being more active? And then I would really love to have as much time as possible for Q&A, so I'll try to watch my time. I can get carried away sometimes, but please do put questions in the chat, and I'll try to monitor them, but I'll answer questions more in an informal way toward the end. So starting with Secular Strategies clients. So one of them, if you haven't heard of them, is Smart Recovery. If you have heard or worked with Smart Recovery, I'd love to hear about that in the chat. But if you haven't heard of them before, they're a national nonprofit that provides free, evidence-based, secular, self-empowering meetings, peer support meetings for those who are recovering from addiction. And it's important to note that they're secular because if you may not be aware or that 12-step programs, AA and NA, are faith-based programs. There's nothing wrong with that. AA works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for everybody. There's a lot of people, both non-religious folks and people of faith, who that just doesn't work for them to have appealing to a higher power be part of their recovery. The other aspect of what Smart Recovery does that makes it different from faith-based programs is that, or from 12-step programs in particular, is that they're expressly supportive of medication-assisted treatment. If you're not familiar with MAT, it's a really, really important tool in our toolbox in addressing the opioid epidemic and addiction overall. This idea that you can just, through sheer will, recover from something like heroin is just not based on science. With what we understand about what happens to the body during withdrawal, medication-assisted treatment is a really critical science-based approach to recovery from addiction. And what I love about this client and the work is that it's both brings in that church-state separation issue of making sure, for example, that if you are mandated by the government through a court system to attend recovery meetings, we're working to ensure that you are provided with secular options, because there have been a number of court cases where people were denied a secular option. And, you know, that's a really vulnerable position to be in when you're looking at getting your sentence reduced, or, you know, being sentenced for your DOI or whatever it is. You know, your freedom is on the line. But and also your path to recovery is on the line, right? And so there have been a number of cases, and luckily all of them, every time someone has been denied a secular option and they sued, they've won every single time. So now it's just a matter of making sure that at the local level, that the judges and everyone involved is making sure those options are available. Both because people have a First Amendment right to a secular option, but also because of the science aspect, the public health aspect, that we know if you are someone who's doing the right thing, getting prescribed something by day, and then going to an AA meeting and told that you're not doing the right thing, that you're not clean because you're not like abstinent in their perspective, which is not really the best practice now, then you're getting that dissonance between what, you know, whether or not you're doing the right thing. So that's a great organization. It's a nonprofit, and there are many ways that you can get involved. You can become a trained facilitator. You can, you know, support your local Smart Recovery meetings in many ways. So if you've never heard of them, I'm sure there are meetings in Colorado. So that's just something to be aware of. And, you know, there's a lot, I'm sure there's got to be folks here who have family or friends who have been impacted by that issue. And I've talked to so many people who have shared that their family or friends, you know, the only option they had was AA, and it didn't work for them. And a lot of people I work with through SMART, once they found SMART, it was really life-changing. So wanted to mention SMART Recovery. Two of my clients are PACs. There are 2 PACs, political action committees, in the country that specifically focus on non-religious voters and getting elected officials who are openly non-religious elected. And they are the Center for Free Thought Equality, which is the political and advocacy arm of the American Humanist Association, and Secular Democrats of America, which is more explicitly partisan. And I fully want to recognize and say, just as a caveat, that this is a nonpartisan space. And I'm going to speak to a little bit of party organizing from my experience, because most of that has been in the Democratic Party, but that applies to really anybody in any political party. If you're secular Republican, secular Green, secular Libertarian, the same kinds of organizing tools and way of advocating for church-state separation and secular values can be applied no matter what. So just, you know, wanted to put that out there. And the last one, Ex-Muslims of North America, is a member organization of Secular Coalition for America, and they work to defend, amplify the voices of Muslims who have left the faith, ex-Muslims, and advocate for free speech and freedom of conscience, and raise a lot of awareness about what it means, unfortunately, for a lot of ex-Muslims to deal with apostasy and blasphemy laws as crimes. As well as the impact that they get from their own community and families for being outed or coming out as ex-Muslim. And the last one I want to bring attention to is Jews for Secular Democracy, which is an initiative of Society for Humanistic Judaism, which is also a member organization of Secular Coalition for America. So if you do identify as Jewish or you're an ally to the Jewish community, there is a way to bring your Jewish identity into your secular organizing. So I just mentioned all of those because, I mean, that's a really, just right there, those, and there's many more organizations. If you're Jewish and secular, there's a place for you. If you're more interested in sort of, you know, impacting human lives, whether it's addiction or something like that, there's organizations for that. There's Foundation Beyond Belief if you want to focus on other sorts of social services. If you're really political and you want to, bring your secular activism into your politics, you've got PACs that you can work with. So there's really an endless amount of ways to incorporate your secular activism into what works for you, because people are interested in different things. You might not be super interested in political parties, but you might be really interested in volunteer service, right? There's so many ways to incorporate it. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the general threats and opportunities and challenges. So I want to start by reminding everyone about January 6th. If you haven't seen any of these, if you haven't heard this before, then I'm going to put some links in the chat here, a few different articles where folks wrote about this. But I think it's really, really important for the secular community to understand that Christian nationalism was a huge part of the insurrection, that the people who, largely the people who attacked our capital and attacked our democracy were Christian nationalists. And it's really important to understand that and understand what Christian nationalism, is. Because if we don't understand Christian nationalism, we're not understanding the bigger picture of what's happening in our politics today. And this is not new, by the way. The January 6th was kind of like the most visible representation of Christian nationalism, but this has been a movement that's been going on for decades. And so what is Christian nationalism? A really simple way to think about it is the merging of Christian and American identity. The idea that to be an American is to be Christian, and to be a Christian is to be American. And I want to bring to your attention also, I'm going to put this in the chat as well, that there's a great campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And I really encourage you to read the full statement of principles there. And they have signers, hundreds, if not thousands, of Christian clergy, not all progressive lefties, they're across the political spectrum, but these are folks who feel really strongly, as they should, that to mix nationalism and Christianity hurts both. It makes you less, it doesn't make you more patriotic, makes you less patriotic, and it doesn't make you more Christian. It actually undermines, the Christian faith for Christians, because there is no nationality, right, of Christianity, right? That's not really how Christianity is supposed to work. And I think another thing that's really important to understand, and that the statement of principles on that website also addresses, is that there is a very strong, not coincidental, overlap between white supremacy and Christian nationalism. If you think about some of the symbols and things we saw on January 6th, not only were we seeing lots of Jesus Saves signs, we were seeing an opening Christian prayer by the insurrectionists when they entered the property illegally. We also saw a noose, right? We saw hanging gallows, and there were all of these there was anti-Semitic imagery, right? This was all coming together, but this is not accidental. And I really recommend that you read more on this issue, because the more we understand how these things all come to play, the better we'll be able to advocate and also bring in allies who may not understand that our issues are their issues. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But I wanted to just remind you, I know it's been a few months and I'd love to forget about it, but we cannot forget about January 6th, how serious it was, and what it has to do with us. Obviously, it impacted all Americans. My concern as a secular activist is to make sure that it is not lost on the American people that Christian nationalism was a huge part of January 6th, and the role that Christian nationalist leadership, who were right there promoting the big lie with Donald Trump that the election was somehow stolen, they really played a huge part in fomenting the kind of what we ended up seeing. So the links that I gave earlier, there's an opinion piece about it. There's two of them. And one is actually about a statement of more than 100 evangelical leaders that condemned the role of Christian nationalism in January 6th. So there is actually a lot more conversation among Christians about this, who are now realizing that there is this level of radicalization and this melding of Christian identity and American identity in their own churches that they have to address. So another thing that is going to happen any day now, we're still waiting for this decision to come out at the Supreme Court. I want to highlight one because it's timely, but it also really speaks to kind of the larger threat of the Christian nationalist strategy, which is the city of Philadelphia versus Fulton. So basically, and I'm going to really simplify this case for you. The city of Philadelphia, like many localities, contracts with outside groups, nonprofits, to provide social services. And so when the government contracts with other, outside private or nonprofit organizations, they have certain regulations. You provide these services, and here's how we expect you to actually facilitate them. There's rules. And a few Catholic agencies, and so in the context of foster care, child placement, it was found that a few Catholic agencies in Philadelphia were denying otherwise qualified LGBTQ couples from their child placement programs, which was a violation of the contract. And so the city offered some sort of accommodation to deal with the religious objections they had. They denied that accommodation, and they sued. And the lower courts agreed with the city that if the city is giving you taxpayer funding, right, because that's what a government contract is, it's a contract paid for by taxpaying citizens to provide a social service that is supposed to be available equally to all Philadelphians, right, all taxpaying Philadelphians, that the city should be able to say, well, we're not going to contract with you if you're going to discriminate. And the lower courts agreed with the city, but unfortunately the Supreme Court is taking up this issue now, and we do not have a friendly Supreme Court on church-state separation now. And so they could rule in a lot of different ways. Most of the scenarios that experts are predicting are pretty bad, but there's definitely terrible and less terrible versions of how that decision could come out. But I want to highlight it because it's so emblematic of the kind of endgame strategy and goals of Christian nationalists, which is that they feel that they want a privileged status for Christians in every possible way. And they want the broadest possible exemptions from laws that would apply to everybody else, including non-discrimination, on the basis of religion. And not only do they want to be exempted from rules and regulations that apply to everybody else, they want to be able to violate those rules based on religious liberty on our dime, on the taxpayer's dime. There is a sense of entitlement to government contracts, entitlement to funding that should go to public schools, entitlement to our taxpayer dollars. And so we're actually seeing the Fulton kind of scenario play out in a lot of ways. We've seen a number of states introduce bills specifically around adoption and foster care that basically carve out a special exemption for faith-based childcare providers and contractors, allowing them to discriminate even if they're receiving state and federal funding. And a great example of what this can look like under the Trump administration, there was a foster care agency in, I believe it was South Carolina. It was called Miracle Hill. And not only did they deny a Catholic, they also denied a Jewish woman to participate in their programs because they only wanted to serve evangelical Protestants who fit their worldview. And they were receiving state funding while doing it. And they got a special waiver from the Trump administration to continue to do so, to get taxpayer dollars and then deny Catholics and Jews, anybody they wanted, who might have been otherwise qualified, loving foster care families and volunteers. So that's really the end game here. And if you haven't heard of this yet, I'm going to throw it here, called Blitz Watch, right? And this is where American Atheists and Americans United have taken a lot of leadership on this issue. So really, thanks to reporting, we found out a few years ago about something called Project Blitz, which is basically kind of a loose network of Christian nationalist organizations coming together around an agenda to blitz state legislatures with bills that further their agenda. And the playbook was found online, right? And there's different stages of this. And the first stage is things that seem harmless, right? Kind of easy stuff that doesn't necessarily raise the alarm. Things like mandating "In God We Trust" to be prominently displayed in all public schools, right? That actually got passed in a number of states, like Florida, which is now every public school in Florida is required to display "In God We Trust" prominently. So why do they start with stuff like that? Well, because in Florida, it was a Democrat who introduced that bill, right? This is not something that it's just one side or the other. There's so much revisionism around our history that people don't realize, they don't know. And a lot of our politicians and elected officials don't know that "In God We Trust" was not always the national motto, and that "Under God" wasn't always part of our pledge. And the context of when that changed was the 1950s during the Red Scare, as part of this sort of, again, hysteria toward the godless communists, right? That was not really a rosy period of history for the United States. And when you understand the context of where those things came about, and even just educate people, especially elected officials, about the fact that, this isn't been here since the founding, then you'll be surprised how many people are not aware. But if they're operating from a perspective of, well, this is the way it's always been, so this is just what it means to be American. We say "Under God" in our pledge. We "In God We Trust" is our motto. What's the problem, right? This is just the way it's always been. So the reason that they start with those symbolic issues is because it reinforces the myth that we're a Christian nation. It legitimizes the other things that they build on from that, right? So, okay, if we've convinced everyone that this is the way it's been always, and this is a Christian nation, and this is just part of sort of our American traditions. Remember, this is where Christian nationalism comes in. It's merging American identity with Christian identity, which of course means that you other everybody who is not Christian. And of course, it's always the right Christians, right? Who think in a certain way that they're trying to privilege. So that's stage one. What's stage three of Project Blitz? Well, it's the broadest possible religious exemptions, especially from things like non-discrimination laws. And it's being able to discriminate on the basis of religion, or to just have exemptions from things like public health and safety laws. We lost this fight during COVID, where churches were, thanks to the Supreme Court, are now, governors don't have the same level of, discretion to hold houses of worship accountable to the same standards as similar spaces because of religious liberty, regardless of the fact that houses of worship were major super spreaders during COVID. But unfortunately, because of the makeup of the court, Christian nationalists was a top priority for them, that they have succeeded in, to stack the court with folks who do not really respect separation of church and state. So it's not just about these kind of bread and butter LGBTQ issues, reproductive rights. It's so much more than that. It's really being exempt from things that are perfectly common sense public health and safety laws. I mean, things that really religion shouldn't have anything to do with, because you have a really totally objective, neutral way of putting those things out there that don't actually target religion, have anything to do with religion. They want the broadest possible religious exemptions, so that basically like a get out of jail free card for any law that would apply to anybody else and to secular institutions. But of course, their main focus is to be able to discriminate against the LGBT community, but it goes far beyond that, as I've shared with my examples earlier. And they want to be able to do this all on our dime, on the tax dime. They feel entitled to get access to public funding, turn around and discriminate using public funding. So that's something to really be aware of. So that's some of the threats, right? So let's talk a little bit about what the opportunities are here. So the demographic that really underpins the Christian nationalist movement is getting older, and it's a very white population, and it's a population that isn't growing, right? It's shrinking. The religiously unaffiliated is the largest, fastest growing religious demographic in the country. It's very young and it's very diverse. And for all of those reasons, long-term has a much greater demographic advantage. Thing is, the Christian right has known this for a while, that demographically they were going to lose in the long run, and that culturally, they're, especially in recent years, they know that they're losing the culture wars that they've waged, that American people are really not in a great majorities with them on issues like LGBTQ rights. And so that's why their strategy has been codifying their beliefs into law and to our judicial system as much as possible, because the courts in particular, the reason that the courts have been so important to the Christian right is because you can change precedent for generations if you just stack enough of your people with your perspective into courts throughout the land, including the Supreme Court. But we do have this demographic change, right? So one thing I really want to get across that is really important is that this is a great opportunity, right? We have this growing demographic advantage, but do not for a second believe that demographics are destiny. It's not like just naturally, organically on its own by the religiously unaffiliated and the country becoming more secular culturally. That will not change our politics. It will not change our policy. That's not how it works. It's not like just because you're in the majority, suddenly, you know, the whole country changes, right? There are so many examples today of the American people being majority in support of one policy, but that policy is not, you know, what's in place, and there's no reason that it's going to change because of the politics of it, because of all kinds of reasons. So we can't be complacent, just say, yay, our numbers are increasing, which means everything is just going to change. It's just time. That is not true. So that means that we have some challenges. We have this great opportunity to mobilize this growing number of people who agree in large part on a lot of our vision for how we'd like to be governed and how we'd like the role of religion to be. But we need to get organized, which is going to be most of the focus of the rest of this presentation. But first, I want to ask a question and have you guys answer in the chat, because it's going to lead me to the secular activism bit about how do we change this, which is, why do you think that despite the fact, so we've got 1 in 4 Americans are religiously unaffiliated, we skew young, less than 50% of American people are now attending houses of worship regularly. That's as of a few weeks, about a month ago, that we went under that 50% mark. So why do you think that despite increasing in numbers, that non-religious Americans are underrepresented in government? Or why is it that we don't have the political clout that white evangelicals have, for example? Why do you think that is? What are the factors? And I'd love to hear it in the chat, or see it in the chat. Don't be shy. Gerrymandering and voter suppression, in addition to a false narrative that religion represents family values. That's a very good answer. Not enough community support for this behavior. Most seculars are younger, not into politics. Good answers. Any other ideas? Because we're less organized, we're not as motivated and fearful of post-death issues. Okay. Any others? Most people don't care, don't know how serious it is. Don't want family to know. Lack of strong secular voice. Anyone else? Okay, so I would say these are very good answers. I think it's all of the above plus more, right? There's a number of factors at hand here. So I'm going to go sort of one by one. So first of all, yes, gerrymandering and voter suppression is a huge part of kind of why there's so many reasons. So many issues impacted by that. And that's why and this goes to Norm, with your daughter saying her vote doesn't matter. I actually specifically, when I presented about activism to the Secular Student Alliance, because I anticipated that exact kind of response. I have a special slide that I showed them where I said, if you are someone who says the system is rigged, the system doesn't work, it doesn't matter, that's not an excuse to not be active in those systems. If you feel that way, here's a list of organizations that are addressing what I call root cause problems. Root cause problems like gerrymandering and voter suppression. Because if you don't trust the system and don't want to work within the system, even when it's broken, then fix the system, right? It's not an excuse to not get involved. There are real solutions out there about how we can combat voter suppression and make voting more accessible. There are real solutions about how we can move away from gerrymandering. There are real solutions out there for how we can get money out of politics, or at least have more public financing of campaigns. There's ranked choice voting, approval voting. There's a bunch of solutions out there and organizations funded just to work on those issues. And so what I would tell your daughter to do is to ask her maybe some questions about, like, why does she think her vote doesn't count? What are the systemic reasons that maybe she might rightfully feel that her vote doesn't count? And then point her to organizations that are offering solutions and ways for people like her who feel disenfranchised to get involved, not just for herself, but if she feels her vote doesn't matter, then that means that other people's voices aren't being counted. And if she cares about and is invested in democracy and being represented, then she should put her energy into organizations that are trying to fix these problems, because it really is both and. I'm someone who says you got to work, someone has to work from the outside and someone has to work from the inside. It's not either or. We have to do both at the same time, because the system's not going to be fixed overnight. So you have to work within it and play the game. But we also need to fix the system. So you need your agitators on the outside trying to fix the broken system, but you also need people on the inside who are working within the systems we have to make as much incremental progress as we can. I think that's the pragmatic approach, is you do both and. So yes, that's absolutely true. Also, this idea that religion represents family values, and the other comment about not wanting family to know if you're secular. We are definitely, to me, that speaks to stigma, right? So we're not as open as we should be, because there still is stigma for being non-religious. And there's also the flip side of it being harder to be openly atheist as an activist. The flip side of that is that it is so much easier to be active as a person of faith because of religious privilege, which is really, I would, encourage you to think about adding that into your educational vocabulary for yourself, but also in explaining these issues to others in the community. Religious privilege is everything from moving to a town and your neighbor's first question is, what church do you go to, right? Because they're assuming that you're a person of faith, and that you go to a church and not a synagogue or a mosque, right? That's religious and Christian privilege right there. It's being the idea that just by saying you're a person of faith, that you're assumed to be a good person or assumed to have good, strong values, that's religious privilege. And the flip side of that is that we are judged immediately and are stigmatized for being non-religious. We have to prove that we have family values. We have to prove that we're good people. We don't get the benefit of the doubt, right? So that's really, that is a very real thing. And I don't want to discount it at all. I will say though, things are getting better. And the polling is showing that for the first time. And I know it's kind of hard to celebrate this because there's still 40% of Americans who wouldn't vote for an atheist for president, but we are over the 50% mark now. A majority of Americans would vote for an atheist for president. Frank, that wasn't the truth a while ago. Is it 60%? Is that great or perfect? No, but it's a steady improvement over time. The acceptance is happening. That doesn't mean the stigma isn't there, but it is changing. And one of the things I really recommend is, if you are someone who can be openly non-religious safely, and not everyone can, really encourage you to really take the step of being as open as possible about it, because I've run into this issue where I find that non-religious people in areas where it's not a big deal, they don't see the point in being open. And what I tell them is, listen, you pay no social cost for this, but there's a lot of atheists out there who do. And by you wearing it on your sleeve and talking about it, you're speaking for them, because they can't speak for themselves, because they might lose their job. They might lose their entire family. And I've given that lecture to, people in like San Francisco and things like that, who just, they don't see the point. Because there's sort of that disconnect. So if you are in a situation where like, yeah, I don't really feel the need to talk to my neighbors or my friends or anything, if you think you can do that without it being a big deal, please do it, because a lot of people can't. And you might be the first person that neighbor or that friend has talked to about what it means to be an atheist. And that might change the way that they treat other people in their lives, and they might talk to others in their community about it. So there's a lot more work to do to eliminate the stigma. One way as an individual you can really be an activist is literally to talk about it, to share it with people if you feel safe, right? So let me see what the other things here were. Not enough community support for that behavior, and we're less organized. I'm going to get to that in a second, because that's a really great segue for the broader things I want to talk about. I want to talk about seculars being younger and not into politics. I think the same issues we have with young people voting does impact our community because there is that overlap. I think it's a number of things. I think that, it's not new that young people don't vote as much as older people do. Part of it is because of voter suppression, right? So it's really difficult, and they're making it more difficult with ID laws for students to vote. So that's a big part of it. So one way you can address young people being able to vote is getting into voter registration on college campuses, and figuring out in your state, or if you want to travel to, for the midterms or for any election, to another state where there have been voter suppression efforts, be a part of making it as easy as possible for young people to vote, starting with the people around you. But that's a great avenue for activism, because the more young people voting, the better it is for us as the non-religious in our agenda. And I wouldn't necessarily write off young people as not being into politics. I do think a lot of them are turned off by it because they don't see it as being effective ways of voicing. They don't feel heard. They feel the system is broken. And that's where I think, I wouldn't write young people off. I would find ways to empower them and make them feel like their voice does matter, and get them involved in things that they can feel the impact immediately. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So I don't disagree with this comment that we need high profile people who publicly declare their non-religious identity. It is important. But I do think that that's not going to solve everything, right? You can have, even if we had a bunch of celebrities and all this stuff, that's great. And it's important. And that's why, I'm so passionate in particular about getting more openly non-religious elected officials and raising their profiles. So that's really important, because people need to see what's represented to feel safe to come out. But I wouldn't discount how important it is for everyday people to be public about their non-religious identity, because at the end of the day, are people influenced by what elected officials and celebrities say? Absolutely. But they're also really influenced by what their friends and family think and the people that they care about. And that was actually really key for the LGBTQ movement. It wasn't just celebrities. It was that everyday people started realizing, oh, wow, my cousin is gay. My uncle, my friend, someone who I care about, and I can't, my preconceptions about what it means to LGBTQ is conflicting with what I know about this person that I love and care about. And I wouldn't discount the importance and power of being openly non-religious in a local sense, as well as that sort of high profile, because both have a big impact. So I just want to make a note about that. So lack of strong secular voice and not being organized, I want to talk about next, but I'm going to say one last thing in response to someone's comment here, which was, where is it? Tom, you saying that people don't know how serious it is. I do think this is really important to note. There is such a lack of urgency around church-state separation issues. And I guarantee you from my work, I have found that the more that you educate people about what is actually going on in their communities in terms of the incursion of religion and government and how that's impacting things like healthcare and use of public funding and health and safety, people are like aghast, like, wait, that's legal here? Like, really, that's happening? And that really gets people a lot more invested in advocating for church-state separation. It was Americans United for Separation of Church and State that did a poll a few years ago of the average American asking about church-state separation and religious freedom. And one big takeaway of that poll is that, on the one hand, Americans tend to support separation of church and state. However, the average American, according to that poll, does not think that it's under threat, does not think that there's any urgency, That's a huge, huge problem for us. And that's why education is such a huge part of advocacy. You know, advocacy is not just meeting with elected officials and candidates, all these other things I'm going to talk about really shortly, which are super important. But if you don't even have a recognition among the general public that there is a problem with church-state separation, that it's in the Constitution, but it's not actually being practiced, then you're not going to be able to mobilize people, because people, you know, fear and concern is a huge motivator for people. And if they don't think that the house is on fire, they're not going to run out, right? So that's a really important role that you as an individual and this organization can play, because just educating people. Did you know this? Did you know that in a number of states there are religious exemptions for child abuse and neglect? Did you know that hospital mergers between religious and secular hospitals are happening at this alarming rate? And what's happening is, as a result, you could go to a hospital and be denied really critical health care just because the people who own the hospital are operating not under best medical practices, but under religious directives. A lot of people just don't know that this is the case. And just educating about it will get more allies and more people to join the cause. So now what I'm going to talk about is activism, right? Like, what is it? How can you get involved? And I'll give you a number of different ways to do it, both as an individual and as an organization. And then I want to move on to Q&A, answer any and all questions you have. So when I think about activism, I already talked about education and just being open about, well, actually I want to talk a little bit about being open. I think one of the most important things we can do as individuals is to bring our secular identity into everything that we possibly can, into everything that we do. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you are involved in a political party, any political party, I'm going to use Democrats as an example, but this is, you know, totally nonpartisan, so it's just an example. In my work, I have found that when we create spaces like the Secular Caucuses that Cheryl mentioned earlier that I've worked on, what happens is all of these people come out of the woodwork, because there are so many non-religious people, atheists, agnostics, and humanists, who are also identify and vote Democrat. And there's also a lot of Democrats who have no idea that there's such a thing as humanist and atheist groups like this, who are really involved in the party, but they also happen to be atheists and agnostic and humanists. And we pull from both into these spaces where people can suddenly be secular and Democrat. Because this idea that secular people are not involved in things, that they're not joiners, I totally reject that. I think that's totally BS. And I think we should stop telling ourselves that, because we're internalizing it, and we're telling ourselves that, oh, we're just not doers, we're not joiners. That's not true. In fact, there's data showing that atheists in particular are some of the most politically active people in the country. But where's the disconnect? The disconnect is that non-religious people, when they're involved in things, they don't bring their secular identity with them. So their activism is invisible in that sense. So we join our Girl Scout clubs and we join political parties, but we don't have a way to identify, like, I am here and I'm an atheist, right? So we have to create those spaces for ourselves, or else we're not going to be visible. And that's why Secular Democrats has been so powerful for people, because for the first time, you know, in last year when we did phone banks for Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, you could join a phone bank with other secular Democrats. Sure, were you doing the same? You could join any phone bank and make the same phone calls to Georgia voters, but you were surrounded by like-minded people who are also atheists, who wanted to make a difference, and we were able to coordinate with those campaigns. So Warnock's staff and Ossoff staff were working with me, and they knew that it was secular Democrats that were organizing these phone banks, right? So we got the credit, we got the visibility. Were we doing anything different from any of the other phone banks? No, not really. But why did it matter? Because we were able to merge that space where you can, in this space, you're not just a Democrat, you're an atheist Democrat, an agnostic Democrat, you're a humanist Democrat, and it's your humanism, it's your atheism that's bringing you here to this space to make a difference, and the campaign knows it because you're here, right? And it's the same thing with our donations. Do non-religious people donate to campaigns? Of course we do. Do we have a space to send a check through a secular organization? Not until recently, right? if you're a Democrat, right? So now there are ways to work with Secular Democrats of America, so you can do a fundraiser and the campaign is going to get a check from Secular Democrats of, right? And that's something that we're not used to doing, but we really have to start doing more. And this is just the political space, right? You can do this anywhere you go. You can do this in service. And I mentioned Foundation Beyond Belief before. If politics isn't your thing, you want to make a difference with affordable housing or disaster relief, whatever it is, you can do that and bring your secular identity with you by forming a Beyond Belief team and doing whatever service speaks to you, but you bring your secular identity with you, because that visibility is so, so important. One other place, so I want to talk about candidates and elected officials too, because I've talked a lot about what you can do as an individual, but I also want, a lot of you've got board members and members of this group here as well. And even if you're an out of state or there's local atheist and humanist groups, you can join to do this kind of stuff too. So obviously this is a 501c3. 501c3 nonprofits cannot endorse or oppose candidates for office, right? You're not allowed to do that. But does that mean that you can't lobby? No. Does it mean you can't meet with elected officials on behalf of Boulder Atheists? No, you absolutely can. Does it mean that you can't engage candidates? You can, just within certain parameters, right? So you can't endorse candidates, but could you put together a voter guide where here's where the candidates running in Colorado stand on these issues? Yes, you can, as long as you don't say, vote for this one, right? So you can do that. You can send candidates questionnaires. You have to be careful about the way you write the questions, and there's all these rules, but can you do it? Yes, you can. Can you host a candidate forum? Yeah, you can. You just have to invite all of them. You have to invite all the candidates. You can't just invite one. And why is that kind of stuff important? Because we want to get to a point in our community where a candidate is, when they put together their action plan of how they're going to reach voters and how they reach donors and key stakeholders in the community that they feel are going to be important to win their election. We want a candidate in Colorado to put Boulder Atheists on that list. Oh, well, we want them to tell their staff, we gotta get the atheist groups on here, go reach out and get us some way to engage with those voters. We want to be on the map. But to do that, we have to put ourselves on the map. And a great way to do that is to be a group that is seen as engaged. And there are many ways that you can do that in every election cycle, like some of the things I mentioned. And I know that there's a lot of hesitancy because people are afraid to break the rules. And I want to really encourage the leadership to take the time to use great free resources that are out there. I'm just grabbing the link right now, that help C3s like you get involved in those things without breaking the rules. Because here's the thing, houses of worship, which are also nonprofit C3s that are technically have the same prohibition on endorsing or opposing candidates, they have no hesitation. They do not hesitate to get involved in elections. And in fact, they violate the law regularly. We shouldn't, and I'm not saying that we should in any way, but we certainly should be engaging. Just because you're a 501c3 does not in any way mean that you can't engage with candidates in ways that are appropriate and make your voice heard. Because I can tell you, we're the other side is certainly making sure their voices are heard. So I'm gonna put this link in the chat. Boulder Advocacy is a resource put together by an organization called Alliance for Justice. They have all these great resources about how C3s can do all the kinds of things I mentioned. And they have experts that you can schedule appointments with to run things by them, like attorneys who really know what they're talking about. And the whole point, the reason they put this together is because they want more C3s to stop worrying about, oh, we can't do this at all because of the rules or we're not allowed to. They want to empower local groups like yours to get more engaged and feel confident about doing that. So it really encourages a group thinking about how you can do those things. So talk about candidates. And I guess I'll say one more thing about candidates is that by engaging with candidates, you know, some of the time they're going to win, right? The candidates you're interfacing with. So once they're an elected official, they come into office and they already have heard from you. They already know that you're a constituency, which puts you in a great position to then engage them as elected officials. It's also a great way, just going to, you can say there's a congressional candidate in the area, send someone from Boulder Atheist to go and wear a Boulder Atheist shirt and ask a question about church-state separation, right? Because that gets them on the record. You might get them to promise something. You might get them to say, I'm not sure, but I'll talk to my staff. And then you follow up and you get them to take a position on an issue that maybe they weren't even aware of. And at a very basic level, they just got a question from someone in the community with a shirt that says Boulder Atheist, right? So now you have that visibility, because again, we really need to be seen as a constituency. It's not that we're not involved. We've already got atheists at those town halls, but they're not bringing it with them in that really explicit way. And you can open your question, you know, don't be the person where it's like just a comment, not a question, but you can totally open by saying, hi, I know I'm going to borrow, I'm Cheryl, and I'm head of this local group called Boulder Atheists. We have this many members, and here are our values and what's important to us, and then ask the question. And then not only did you just educate the candidate, you educated everybody else at that town hall. We had, I had a volunteer in Illinois years ago do this, not for a candidate, but for his elected official. I think it was Representative Lipinski. And he got up and he shared that he was an atheist and the church-state separation was important to him. And when he finished speaking, before the candidate even responded, the entire audience started clapping because of what he said. Can you imagine how powerful that was for the elected official? Like, this one guy stood up and he said, church-state separation is important to me and I'm an atheist. And the rest of his constituents in that room applauded him, which is like a big thumbs up. So what message did that send? Like, oh gosh, I really need to make sure that I make clear that I support this, because clearly my constituents really love when I do that, right? So, and that was one person who did that. And look how much impact he had at that one event. So I want to talk a little bit about elected officials. The way to think about this as individuals in particular is that elected officials are paid for with your taxpayer dollars. You have a right to an opportunity to express your concerns. They work for you. And so if you are subscribed to action alerts from organizations like Americans United or American Atheists, that's great. That's awesome. You're writing letters to your elected officials. But I would think of that as like the entry point. That is like the baseline of what you should be doing. Because, and I don't want you to think they're not impactful, they are. I can tell you from when I was an intern in the US Senate, there are people who look at those. They're usually like interns or lower level staff like me, but there is someone who reads those things and categorizes them and most of the time you should get a response. I know sometimes I've heard people don't get a response. I just got a response months late from my new senator in California about the Equality Act after I wrote to them. So they do actually look at that stuff. And when it's a hot button issue that maybe their boss isn't sure how they're going to vote, they actually like literally start tallying how many constituents said yes, how many said no, right? How many support and oppose. So, and you might, this feels like forever ago, but when Betsy DeVos was going through her confirmation process, it was very close. Mike Pence had to break the tie for that one. And Susan Collins, she came out and she opposed Betsy DeVos. And one of the things she said in her floor speech about why she was doing it was how many constituents called in opposition to DeVos, right? So that contact actually is really important. But why do I say it's just a baseline? Well, because when you fill out those action alerts, it basically goes to a web form and someone looks at it. But there's a huge difference between building a personal relationship with office and sending a letter like that. And as intimidating as it might sound at first, it's really not as hard as you think to actually do some in-person and these days virtual meetings with your congressional or state or local offices. And the more local you go, the more likely you're actually meeting with the legislator themselves, right? So what I'm talking about in Boulder Atheists, you guys can do this. You can organize meetings where you reach out to, say, the district office of your senator, US senator, or your state senator, or your state rep, and say, on behalf of Boulder Atheists, a group of constituents who live in your district would like to speak with you about X. And, you know, you can figure out what it's going to be. Maybe there's a bill you support, a bill you oppose, something you're concerned about. Maybe you just want to educate them. I always recommend that you use every opportunity to educate, but you also want to have an ask. If you're going to meet with an elected official, try to think of something that you can ask for, or at least thank them for, right? To build that relationship. So that setting up a meeting like that is really not that hard. And the thing about it is that so few people and so few groups actually do that, that when you do, you have this outsized influence. Because if you took the time to schedule a district meeting with the legislator or their staff, in their mind, okay, I'm meeting with 2 or 3 people from Boulder Atheists, but they represent this broader community, right? In their head, they're sort of like multiplying you, you know, because if you're engaged enough to be there, and especially if you're there on behalf of a group, and you have all these statistics about how many non-religious people there are in Colorado and all these other humanist and atheistic groups throughout the state, all of a sudden like, oh, this is a constituency that's really engaged because they came and met with us and were prepared to talk about an issue. This is something that the Christian right does all the time. We need to be going above and beyond these action alerts and actually building relationships with offices. And it's really not that hard to do. And it's after you get it done the first time, it's a lot less intimidating. And what you do is you have that meeting and you get a business card, right? So here's the difference, right? So if you went and you talked to a staff member, maybe it's constituent services, maybe it's the, it could be any staff. There's nothing wrong with meeting a staff member, by the way. Don't ever feel like, oh, if I don't make the head honcho, they don't take me seriously. You want to build relationships with staff because staff are the ones that actually do the work and the research on the issues, right? Your elected officials, they can only be expert in like a few things, right? They know a lot about certain things. On everything else, they are like an inch deep, right? And a mile wide on everything else. And this is actually the power of building these kinds of relationships with offices, is that if you can establish yourself as a resource on, for example, non-religious voters and church-state separation, then whenever something might come up on those issues, well, guess what? The staff member already knows that Cheryl can provide her with resources, and maybe she'll call Cheryl and say, does Boulder Atheists have any resources on this issue? Or do you have a position? Or would you support this bill, right? But how do you get there? Well, you have to build a relationship and establish that you have great information that you can provide on these issues. And that's the power of building those relationships. And I can give you an example of why this is important when I say that, like, if you don't speak for yourself, someone else speaks for you. It really is real, because the Christian right is always present. So when I was lobbying in DC at the city council level for the Death with Dignity Act, and for those of you who aren't familiar, probably a lot of you are, because I think I remember Colorado was a more recent campaign for them. If you have a terminal illness of 6 months or less to live, it gives you the right to request a prescription for medication that will end your life on your own terms, if and when you choose. That's a huge issue that the secular community is really broadly supportive of, and that the religious right hates. It's part of their sort of pro-life agenda. So they lobby very hard against that issue. In DC, I remember this, I'll never forget this meeting with a council member's office, where it was so clear to me that it was a 6-page bill. It was not that long to read, but clearly the staff had not read it, because they said to me, yeah, we're concerned about this bill because we were told that someone with diabetes could qualify. That was a lie. That was a bold-faced lie, right? Like that, and I didn't tell them like that, but I diplomatically explained what was actually in the bill, and that no, you could only qualify for this if you had a terminal illness of 6 months or less to live, plus all the other details. Now, what did I accomplish in that meeting? Not only did I correct their incorrect view, which might have continued to be that view if they weren't corrected, because they clearly maybe we're going to vote on this thing without really reading the 6-page bill. But there's another important thing that I did, which is I established myself as a good source on this issue, and whoever lied to them because about the content of the bill was now an untrustworthy source, because whoever lied to them about what was in the bill is not going to be, they're not going to trust them anymore, right? Because you want to be able to trust that the interest group you're talking to actually knows what the bill says and isn't going to just lie to you about what it is to get their way, because that might in the short term work, but in the long term, if you can have integrity and demonstrate integrity and subject matter expertise, they will come back to you. And them coming back to you, even if they don't end up voting your way, is in the long run is a huge, huge impact. And so I really would encourage you, but also as a group, meet, I'm sure Boulder Atheists, there's probably a lot of people who live close to each other. So you probably share the same elected officials. Once or twice a year, just once or twice a year, schedule an in-person meeting. And these days it can be a Zoom with the or their staff, talk to them about Boulder Atheists, talk about an issue, and then get a business card, right? Get an email address, because the difference between doing an action alert and now you have the business card of the policy advisor or legislative assistant or whoever they are, is that you're emailing them one-to-one. You're not going through the website web form. They now know you on a first name basis, you know them on a first name basis, you have an email thread history, right? That's the difference of going from kind of baseline activism to next level activism with your elected officials. And this stuff is not, until you actually say, please support or oppose this bill, you're not lobbying. If you educate about an issue, you're not lobbying. But even lobbying, which is saying, vote for this bill or oppose, as a C3, as an organization, you can do that too. There's just a limit to how much you can do it in terms of like the percentage of your resources. And that's where Boulder advocacy comes into. So if you start doing that kind of thing, trust me, you have plenty of room to do it. Just do your research, go talk to the experts so that you know how to do it. But also as an individual, if you're not wearing like a C3 hat, you're not there on behalf of Boulder Atheists, you're just there on behalf of, Jerry as a person, right? You don't have to worry about that, because you're a constituent in that room. And you have a right, because you pay their salary, to tell them what you think and how they can better represent you. And the last thing I'll say on this is that if you have elected officials, that I get this all the time, that people who live in areas where they feel like their elected officials are really good on church-state separation, they say, oh, I don't need to meet with them, they already vote my way. And then people who have representatives who are more not friendly to church-state separation say, oh, there's no point, they're not going to listen to me. Well, if that's the attitude, then all of a sudden there's no elected officials hearing from atheists on anything. And so what I would say to that is that for folks who have the great privilege of elected officials who are great on our issues, great. The question is, how can you convert that ally to a champion? What have they done for you lately? If they're so great on our issues, what can we ask them to champion for us, right? Because Cheryl mentioned to me before the meeting what the group has been doing. And one thing she mentioned that I was really excited about is getting engaged with American Atheists. And American Atheists is really leading the charge on state level advocacy. And one of the things they're doing is they're putting together report cards every year on where the states stand on church-state separation issues. And there's no perfect state. There's not a single perfect state. You have states with very surprising issues, and you have states where things could just be improved, right? There's the kind of like, okay, maybe there's a lack of a negative law, but there could be a positive one that we could introduce, right? And American Atheists is now drafting model legislation that you have ready to go, that you can share with explainers to your elected officials. And all you have to do is organize yourself, but all the work is done for you. They're also tracking state legislation. So these resources are there for you. And if you're in a state where you feel like Colorado, from what I've heard, I mean, you have a very friendly legislature to these issues, then the question should be, great, what opportunity do we have to ask our allies who are so good on these issues to champion something for us, right? Because our community is so used to being on the defense that we don't think about how we can be proactive when we have that opportunity. And if you're in an area where you have an elected official who is not very friendly to your issues, well, gosh, they should still know that they have atheist constituents, and them and their staff should be educated, and they should at least know that there's opposition and where that opposition is coming from. And you know what? There may be some issues that they'll support you on. You know, you should always give them the benefit of the doubt, and do your research and see if maybe there's some issue they could support you on. I certainly, even with how toxic Washington is right now, just 2 years ago, I found that I could talk to Republicans about addiction recovery issues with no problem, because there's not a single Republican that doesn't have addiction issues in their districts and in their state. And even, you know, Republicans understand, especially if they're in a place like West Virginia, where they're really impacted by the issue, their staff are educated on these things. And I found both Republicans and Democrats agreeing on the need for more secular and MAT supportive options, right? There's also, I had luck talking to both Democrats and Republicans about atheists in the military and making sure they have equal access to resources, right? So there are some places where no matter who your representative is, you might have some ability to work with them. At the very least, you know, think about it as a long game, right? If you're ever going to have influence on a legislator, you're certainly not going to have any until they know you exist, right? So you have to start by, at least, even if you're the minority of your district, or, you know, they're never going to really pay attention, they should at least know that they have secular constituents, and that in itself makes an impact, because a lot of times you can really, at the very least, just kind of disabuse them of these stereotypes that they might have. Because if their staffer or that legislator has never met an atheist before, you might be the first one, and they may not agree with you, but if you're really polite and civil, they'll say, gosh, you know, I don't agree with the damn thing Cheryl says, but she's a very nice person. And she took the time to meet with us, you know? So maybe, you know, they rethink what an atheist looks like and sounds like, and realize that they're a constituent just like anyone else. And there's value in just that in itself. So the last thing I'll talk about, because I talked about sort of the electoral space. I talked about engaging with elected officials. I also want to kind of go, it sort of has to do with the electoral space, but I want to encourage you really to think about your political parties. In addition to getting involved with elections, it's really, and you can do that in a nonpartisan way too, right? Getting out the vote, reaching those young secular people and all of that. Really think about joining your local political club, right? So just as an example, and it can be Greens, Libertarians, Republicans, whatever. But you'll be surprised how much can happen just by showing up. A lot of what I found, you could get a lot done in the political realm just by showing up and being willing to do some work. So check out your local Democratic club, Green club, whatever it is, and see what's happening. See if there are opportunities to run for a position on a committee, maybe the state executive committee, maybe the local county committee, maybe they're looking for people to run for delegates or alternates to the next political convention. These are great ways to get involved and once you're in those spaces and you know people and you get connected and you know how things work, you can start bringing secular issues to the agenda. And I can tell you in particular that there's already a group in Colorado of Colorado Democrats who are working to start a Secular Caucus. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know and I'll put you in touch with who's working on that. In Colorado, you guys don't have caucuses in the Democratic Party, you call them statewide initiatives, which I've learned. So there is a movement to start one. And why is that important? Well, because the political parties have a huge influence on the candidate pipeline of who runs for office, who's going to get the party support, and they have platforms, right? They have messaging that they put out there, and they have infrastructure to reach voters. And so if you are able to influence the culture of the party and to get secular issues on the agenda and to get them to start thinking about, gosh, how can we, the Colorado Democratic Party, do a better job of reaching young secular voters or just secular voters in general, that would be huge. But unless you are advocating on behalf, they're in that space to talk about it, who's going to speak for us? And I'll give you one example of this. So the Secular Caucus in Nebraska, their Democratic Party was opening their meetings with prayer. And so they challenged it. And one of the things that came out of the back and forth was the party agreeing to a sensitivity training, which I'm now putting together and is going to happen fairly soon. So we'll have Democratic leadership trained on who non-religious voters are, how they can be more inclusive of non-religious people in their party. Now, why did that happen? Because there were Democrats or secular in the party who said, no, we need to stop the prayer before the meetings, and here's why. And there was a pushback. But because of the pushback, there was discussion, a discussion that the leadership just never had to have before until there were secular people organized within the party to say something about it. And so I'm going to close by saying that no matter what you're interested in, no matter where your activism is now or whether you're active at all, there is absolutely endless ways for you to make an impact, whether it's in politics or in your community, anywhere. But bringing your secular identity with you, if you are able to, is really the key. Of like, get involved, but get involved as a humanist, as an atheist. There's really endless ways to do it. And now is a really great time, not just because we have great opportunities in working with this administration and with this kind of these changing cultural attitudes toward non-religious people, but also it's never been more urgent. It's never been more urgent. I mean, and you'll remember I started with January 6th. Christian nationalism is a massive threat. And still to this day, even after January 6th, there's too many Americans who don't understand what Christian nationalism is and how it's impacting all of these different issues. And so I'm going to throw a few more links in the chat and go to Q&A. These are links to the National Coalition for Public Education, which opposes vouchers and all voucher schemes. Voucher schemes basically just divert public funds to private religious schools, the majority of which are religious. But lesser known, I think, and not talked about enough, is that the roots of vouchers and privatization of schools, of public schools, has very racist roots, right? It has segregationist roots. And the impact studies have shown is that these charter and private schools are really reinforcing racial segregation in schools. And so I didn't get to talk about sort of these intersections very much. I want to go to Q&A and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about this, but I'll just note very, very quickly that understanding the intersection of church-state separation with other issues like racial justice and tax policy and healthcare is a great way to get other organizations and people who care about other issues on board. If you understand what church-state separation has to do with their issues and what their issues have to do with ours, we're going to be able to coalition build a lot broader. But you have to be able to understand how those systems work together. Understanding why does white supremacy overlap with Christian nationalism? Why is the voucher system racist? Like, what are the racist roots of it? Because you want to meet people where they are and where their concerns are. So I just shared that. I'm also sharing a link from the Americans United blog, which talks about the way that Christian right organizations like the Family Research Council and Alliance Defending Freedom, that they're backing voter suppression efforts, right? So that's another intersection, voter suppression, Christian nationalism. And then lastly, I'm putting some links here to just give you, this is a great example of how to talk about an issue intersectionally. This is from Center for American Progress, where they're talking about immigration intersecting with reproductive justice. And I share it just so you can start thinking about like, well, gosh, if I'm talking to ACLU people or Planned Parenthood people or LGBTQ groups or Black Lives Matter, how can I, show up for them, and how can they show up for us, right? And one of the, you have to start by showing up yourself for other issues that are important to other people. You can't just show up to groups and say, work for church-state separation issues, but you can better understand what things like systemic racism and healthcare inequities and education inequities. Religion touches on every single policy area. Christian nationalists have made sure of it. The better that we understand those things and that we can communicate it, the better we're going to be able to get allies on board with incorporating church-state separation into this broader social justice movement. But we also have to understand what those issues have to do with church-state separation. So I'm going to stop there. I know I covered a lot. Hopefully you all have questions. I am happy to answer them.